You wake up one morning with a fever and a sore throat, believing yourself to be stricken by influenza. You find yourself worried but sluggish, wanting nothing more than to go to bed and get some rest. You lie down, you awake. 10, 20, maybe even 30 years later, only to find that life has passed you by. You're told you're one of the lucky ones, that others like you either never woke up or never woke up quite the same. 1916. The world finds itself in chaos. World War I is underway, with massive amounts of people drafted in the largest scale global conflict in history. In a year, the first reports of a highly contagious deadly influenza would begin to surface. This influenza, known as the Spanish flu, would become a pandemic that would claim more than 100 million lives. The story begins against this backdrop, with an accomplished physician named Konstantin von Economo. Von Economo was working at the University of Vienna, and a large portion of his work was in the field of neurology. He was among the first to take interest when an increasing number of patients were being admitted with symptoms that hinted towards an outbreak of meningitis. Economo was skeptical of this diagnosis by the other doctors, believing that the symptoms patients were presenting with were pointing to a novel syndrome. Many of the patients would die soon after arriving, allowing Economo an opportunity to examine the brains of the deceased and begin publishing his findings. Elsewhere in Europe, at a military hospital in France, a physician named René Cruchet was also noticing the possibility of a novel epidemic. Soldiers would present to him with various neurological symptoms, but one stood out: the fact that before many of these patients passed away, their bodies would lock in place, leaving them somewhere between paralyzed and comatose. What neither Cruchet nor Economo knew was that they were among the first two investigating what would become one of the strangest medical mysteries in human history, an epidemic that turned humans into living statues. Whatever the disease was, it was bizarre, a nightmare unfolding in the pages of clinical reports. One of the difficulties in initially examining the cases was just how volatile symptoms could be. The acute phase, referring to when the body begins to fight an infection, had almost too many symptoms to list. Patients would have a sudden onset of everything from headaches, shivering, vomiting, sore throats, slurred speech, and stiff movements. 1 hour they would be unable to stand from the tiredness, the next they might be manic with energy. Although a low-grade fever was common across most cases, most of the significant symptoms were neurological in presentation, pointing to an ailment of the brain and its surrounding matter. The disease progressed with two avenues, with totally contradictory symptoms. Many patients would begin to feel ill before experiencing symptoms of mania, such as an increase in energy, rapid speech, and intrusive thoughts. This dream, however, has largely been forgotten by history, as it usually meant that the patient would survive with little or no long-term damage to their neurology or psychology. The deadlier version presented in the exact opposite way. All the symptoms would build up as a slowness in the patients. Drowsiness, confusion, lethargy, and decreased motor skills were commonly reported. Patients who had the chance to describe the onset of the next phase spoke about feeling untethered from time. Then, if the disease progressed, paralysis would set in. Patients would be going about their day or resting in bed due to the fever, only to suddenly have their bodies stiffen. It would be like they were locked in a place in whatever position they were in. They would become unresponsive and their bodies would resist being pushed into more comfortable positions, showing that this was not exactly a coma. Terrifyingly, it soon became evident to physicians that many patients were asymptomatic before becoming paralyzed. Although most sufferers would be warned of an infection thanks to the low-grade fever, sore throat, and stiff muscles, some weren't as lucky. Numerous reports exist of individuals going about their lives with no noticeable problems. Suddenly, without any warning, their bodies would tense up and they'd become unresponsive. Some would remain frozen like this for decades. Most would never wake up again. As the paralysis persisted for months and even years, patients would lose the color in their skin, looking quite literally like they had become marble. The prognosis of the disease, what has informally been called the sleepy sickness, was poor. Many who did eventually break from their paralysis gave accounts like those of coma patients. They described occasional or even total awareness of their surroundings, being able to hear and feel and sometimes even see the world progress around them. These accounts were unfortunately few and far between, considering the disease had an especially high mortality rate. Just as in coma patients, the longer a person is unresponsive, the worse the possibility of survival becomes. Unfortunately, most of the sufferers died in their paralysis, and many who woke up were not the same as before. They'd suffer from various neurological and psychiatric issues for the rest of their lives, never really experiencing a true awakening from the sickness. As the Spanish flu began to grip the globe, the sleepy sickness spread as something like an undercurrent, a phantom plague almost. People were too focused on the evident spread of influenza to realize or be concerned about the almost absurd reports of people becoming living statues. Don't be fooled that this meant that the epidemic was insignificant. Estimates vary, but consistently suggest that at least 5 million people were affected by the disease. Of this massive figure, 1.6 million people would die in the years during or after the epidemic. Imagine this time in history. You wake up one morning with a fever and a sore throat, believing yourself to be stricken by influenza. You find yourself worried but sluggish, wanting nothing more than to go to bed and get some rest. You lie down, you awake. 10, 20, maybe even 30 years later, only to find that life has passed you by. You're told you're one of the lucky ones, that others like you either never woke up or never woke up quite the same.
You're watching on Disrupt. Wake up, Theo. Region lockers have you.
Who is this?
Follow the green locket. Private internet access is 100% open source. It safeguards your privacy by blocking trackers, ads, and malicious sites.
How do I know you're telling the truth?
Examine my code for yourself. See how deep the encryption truly is.
Do you always look at it in coding?
One gets used to it. All I see is next-gen server infrastructure, or right there token-based dedicated IP.
How much is it?
$3 a month plus 2 free months in the description. Knock, knock, Theo.
Who's there?
What?
You said knock knock. What's the joke?
That's just what they said in the movie.
That doesn't make any sense.
Economo's publication on his findings helped corroborate the disease across the world. He dubbed it Encephalitis Lethargica, roughly translating to an inflammation that caused lethargy. Other forms of encephalitis were and still are common, but none are quite as strange as this one. Quickly, hundreds of other physicians found Economo's work and began sharing their own experiences of witnessing an emergent epidemic. Most of the initial reports came from Vienna in France, but soon every major continent was grappling with an epidemic that turned men, women, and children into living statues. In the US, the Surgeon General's medical officer proposed that the focus should be in investigating the link between the syndrome and influenza. He believed that the sleepy sickness was not coincidentally happening at the same time as the deadliest pandemic in modern history, and rather was an after effect of exposure to influenza. In the UK, opinions were far more varied, but most agreed that the link between the Spanish flu and encephalitis was dubious at best. What was especially concerning to physicians was the fact that Encephalitis Lethargica seemed almost random in its spread. Although some exceptions were noted, whatever the sleepy sickness was, it did not seem to move from person to person most of the time. With a history of influenza also breaking down as a potential precursor to the syndrome, the sleepy sickness seemed like it could strike anyone at any given moment. And for decades at a time, it did strike, over and over again, Up until 2005, there were still survivors stuck in that paralysis, their existence confined to the back rows of chronic care wards. Time has brought more questions than answers to the causes and sudden disappearance of the epidemic. It remains one of the most baffling medical mysteries of the last century. Some theories hypothesize that the disease was a post-viral syndrome. It could be that the Spanish flu wasn't just coincidentally happening at the same time. It might have either weakened the immune system of patients or been a long-term side effect that would only present itself after a recovery from influenza. Viral technologies at the time were of course less robust than they are today. Despite this, today's doctors noted that Economo and his contemporaries categorized the symptoms in excellent detail. One other fact stood out from this early research. Although many of the survivors of the acute phase of the syndrome would go on to have varying degrees of neurological and psychological issues, physicians were quick to note that the most common issue in long-term survivors was the development of Parkinson's. One especially noteworthy development came in the early 70s. Dr. Oliver Sacks was a neurologist working at Beth Abraham Hospital in New York, tasked in the chronic care unit for surviving but still comatose patients. He believed in the potential of the protein drug L-DOPA in the treatment of Parkinson's amongst other neurological issues. He administered it to comatose survivors of the sleepy sickness epidemic, and to the surprise of the medical community, many of the patients woke up. It was an incredible breakthrough. His memoir, Awakenings, was adapted into a film, stressing the inspirational nature of those regaining their lives after being untethered from time. And yet, I can't help but wonder how I'd react if I were one of those patients. I can't imagine what it feels like going about my day-to-day life, having my dreams and hopes and fears and wants. I feel a bit feverish, hoping that a good night's rest will bring better things in the morning. But still, it's hard to imagine yourself in the position of one of those patients. Sacks' memoir has received some scrutiny despite its status as a classic in medical literature. On the one hand, the book has been accused of using the stories of patients as inspiration fodder. In terms of L-DOPA, the miracle of seeing patients awaken after decades of being comatose was temporary. Patients would inevitably experience hallucinations and neurological troubles before devolving back into their previous comatose states. The cause of the disease remained unknown, although there has been no confirmed recurrence of the disease since the epidemic in the 20th century. It would be hard to verify outbreaks in the first place. The disease is considered legitimate, but its mysterious nature has translated to a vague diagnostic scheme, no apparent cause and no effective treatment, a plague disappearing into time. That is until 1993, when a young woman was booked into the hospital. Becky Howells was a 23-year-old when presented at the emergency room. Doctors were distressed by how extreme her symptoms were. From an extreme fever to a violent shaking that rocked through her body, her state deteriorated even more after she was booked in. Doctors quickly realized that there was a critical inflammation in her brain, but with no apparent cause, things looked dire. John Oxford was a virologist who had been suspecting that an outbreak of Encephalitis Lethargica was long overdue, and when he heard of Becky Howells' mysterious case in 1993, it seemed he was correct. He contacted the hospital and began working with them on a hunch. With some work, he got some tissue samples from the original brains of the victims, and just as before, no evidence of a virus was found. Oxford was undeterred from his theory. He believed that Becky Howells' presentation was too similar to those of the original reports of the sleepy sickness to be anything else. After some deliberation, doctors agreed that this was the same sleepy sickness and gave her an official diagnosis. Howells would eventually make a full recovery, and in the aftermath of her diagnosis, a medical cold case has been given new life and inspired dozens of new researchers. A notable example comes from Dr. Russell Dale and Dr. Andrew Church, who published their theory in 2004. They realized that the consistency across both modern and historical reports was not the paralysis nor the low-grade fever, but the incidence of a sore throat. Since Becky Howells' diagnosis, more than 24 further cases were confirmed. and Dale and Church realized that every single one of the diagnosed patients they tested had a rare form of strep. Although it didn't entirely solve the mystery, it reignited the movement, believing that the sleepy sickness was not an invasive infection itself, but a severe complication caused from the immune system overreacting to another disease. Questions still remain, but at least there is some attempts to answer them. For his part, Oxford still believes another recurrence of the epidemic may be on the horizon. Until we know what caused it, we won't be able to prevent it, he stressed in an interview with the BBC. Perhaps time will give us a more concrete conclusion, but for now, this strange disease almost sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. The idea of becoming a human statue, unable to move or speak, with months passing by, then years. The century continues without you, and all you can do is think, aware of your surroundings, trapped in the tomb of your own body. Thanks for watching, and have a good night. Good night.